They didn't carry him gently through candlelit corridors. There were no slow-motion glances, no cinematic silences, no soft choral music fading in the background. The final hours of Jesus of Nazareth unfolded in the middle of a city packed with hundreds of thousands of people. In the dark, in the heat, across the broken stones of a city that smelled of animals and smoke and unwashed bodies pressed together for one of the most politically charged weeks of the Jewish calendar. And almost everything you think you know about those hours, the sequence, the sounds, the social dynamics, the physical reality, has been quietly softened by 2,000 years of artistic interpretation. What was Passover Jerusalem actually like in 33 AD? What did an arrest look like when Roman soldiers moved through narrow alleyways at night? What happened to a man's body before the crucifixion even began? And why did everything, every single detail of those hours, carry a weight of meaning that would have been immediately legible to everyone watching and is almost entirely invisible to us today? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. It changes what we see when we read about Peter warming himself by the fire, about Pilate washing his hands, about the crown of thorns, about the darkness that fell over the land. These were not poetic flourishes. They were events rooted in a specific place, a specific time, a specific set of social rules that governed honor and shame, life and death, purity and contamination. Once you see the world, those events happened inside. You cannot unsee it. Begin before the arrest. Begin with the city itself. Jerusalem in Passover week was a city under pressure. The population of Jerusalem in the first century sat somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people in normal times. But during Passover, the three great pilgrimage festivals of the Jewish year, that number expanded dramatically. Ancient sources suggest the city swelled to 3, 4, perhaps 5 times its normal population. Pilgrims arrived from Egypt, from Babylonia, from Asia Minor, from Rome itself. They carried their Passover lambs. They carried their offerings. They slept on rooftops, in courtyards, in tents pitched on the hillsides outside the walls. Every available room was shared. Every inch of street was occupied. The Romans knew what this meant. Every Passover, the Roman prefect relocated from his administrative base in Caesarea Maritima, a comfortable coastal city with a proper palace, a harbor, Mediterranean breezes, to Jerusalem. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Passover was the festival that commemorated Israel's liberation from Egypt, from an empire, from a foreign occupying power. Every year, in a city already crackling with messianic expectation, that symbolism was live and dangerous. Pontius Pilate brought additional troops with him. The garrison at the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the Temple Mount from the northwest corner, was reinforced. Soldiers were visible. The message was not subtle. The empire was watching. If you were a Jewish pilgrim arriving at Jerusalem that week, you would have felt this tension the moment you crested the Mount of Olives and looked west across the Kidron Valley toward the city. The temple dominated the skyline, its white limestone and gold leaf catching the sun in a way that ancient writers described as almost blinding, like a mountain covered in snow and fire. But you would also have seen the Antonia fortress, and you would have known what it represented. Two worlds occupied the same small hilltop, the sacred and the imperial, the Torah and the eagle standard of Rome. And in 33 AD, a Galilean teacher who had entered the city 5 days earlier, to crowds waving palm branches and shouting the words of Psalm 118, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," was still somewhere inside those walls. If you enjoy walking through history like this, not just reading the stories, but inhabiting the world where they happened. This channel exists precisely for that. Subscribe, because there is far more to explore. The night of the arrest began in a garden. Gethsemane. The name comes from the Aramaic gat shmanim, which means oil press. It was a working agricultural space on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, likely owned by someone sympathetic to Jesus and his circle, used often enough that Judas Iscariot knew exactly where to lead a detachment of men in the dark. The garden sat just across the Kidron Valley from the eastern wall of the city. In April, the Kidron could carry a trickle of water, but during Passover week, it carried something else. The blood from the temple sacrifices, tens of thousands of lambs slaughtered over the preceding days, channeled through the drainage system of the Temple Mount and released into the valley below. Ancient sources confirm this. The valley, during Passover, ran with blood. This is not a metaphor. This is hydrology and religious practice intersecting in a way that would have been completely unremarkable to anyone living in Jerusalem and completely incomprehensible to anyone living in the modern West. The smell would have been overwhelming. The sight, in the moonlight, Passover always falls on a full moon, would have been striking. And somewhere on the far side of that valley, in an olive grove still fragrant with the cold air coming off the hills, Jesus of Nazareth was praying alone, while his closest disciples fell asleep. The Gospel accounts describe his distress in physical terms: sweating, falling to the ground, asking that the cup be taken from him. These are not the composed gestures of a man who had made peace with what was coming. They are the documented responses of a human body and mind under catastrophic stress. The Greek word used in Luke's account, agonia, is the same word used in athletic contexts for the extreme exertion of a competitor at the edge of his capacity. He was not serene. He was in the most human crisis a person can enter. Full knowledge of impending suffering with no way out except forward. That is where the arrest found him. The detachment that came for him was not a small group. The Gospel of John uses the Greek word spera, a Roman cohort, or at minimum, a detachment from one. Combined with the temple guard sent by the chief priests, the group moving through the darkness toward Gethsemane likely numbered in the dozens, possibly more than 100 men. They carried torches and lanterns. They carried weapons. On a night with a full Passover moon already flooding the hillside with pale light, the procession coming down from the city and across the Kidron would have been visible from a considerable distance. This detail matters. Jesus did not flee. The Gospel of John makes a point of describing him walking forward to meet them, asking who they were looking for, and when they said Jesus of Nazareth, responding with the words, "I am he," in Greek, ego eimi, which in the context of Jewish scripture carried resonances far beyond simple self-identification. The crowd, John records, stepped back and fell to the ground. Whether this was a response to something supernatural or simply the startled reaction of men who expected to find a fugitive and instead found someone walking calmly toward them in the dark, the text insists on it. The arrest did not begin with Jesus cornered. It began with Jesus in control of the only thing he had left, the terms of his own surrender. What followed was fast and ugly. One of his disciples, John identifies him as Peter, drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. This was not a trained soldier making a tactical move. This was a fisherman from Galilee with a short blade, probably terrified, lunging in the dark at the nearest target. The servant's name was Malchus. Luke, the physician, records that Jesus touched the ear and healed it. Then he told Peter to put the sword away. The moment of potential violent resistance was closed before it opened. And then every disciple who had been awake enough to see what was happening ran. They left him. This is stated plainly in the Gospels, and it is easy to read past. But in the social world of first-century Judea, abandonment by one's closest companions in a moment of public crisis was not a neutral event. It was a statement. It meant that no one vouched for him, no one stood with him, no one placed their own safety on the line beside his. In a culture organized around community, kinship, and collective honor, being arrested alone was already a form of public shaming before a single question had been asked. He was bound. The Greek word suggests his hands were tied and taken first to Annas. This is a detail that most modern readers skip over too quickly. Annas was the former high priest, deposed by the Romans years earlier, but still the most powerful figure in the temple establishment. 5 of his sons had served as high priest. His son-in-law Caiaphas was the current high priest. The family controlled the temple markets, the money-changing operation, the supply of approved sacrificial animals. When Jesus had overturned the tables in the temple court earlier that week, he had not simply made a spiritual point about prayer and commerce. He had directly attacked the economic infrastructure of one of the most powerful families in Judea. Annas was not a disinterested religious authority weighing a theological question. He was a man whose business had been disrupted, whose family's prestige had been publicly challenged, who had every material reason to want this Galilean removed from the equation before Passover week escalated further. The preliminary interrogation at Annas's house was informal, extra-legal by Jewish standards, and brief. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus responded by pointing out that he had taught openly in synagogues and in the temple, in front of everyone. If Annas wanted to know what he had said, he should ask the people who had heard him. It was a legally precise response, and one of the guards standing nearby struck him across the face for it. This moment, hold it for a second. A strike across the face in the ancient Near East was not primarily a physical act. It was a social one. It was a public declaration that the person being struck had no standing to speak as an equal, no right to answer back, no dignity worth protecting. The blow was meant to teach through the body what words had apparently failed to establish, that this man was no longer a teacher, no longer a rabbi commanding respect in public spaces, no longer someone whose responses needed to be taken seriously. He was a prisoner, and prisoners in that world occupied the lowest possible rung of a social hierarchy that already had very little room at the bottom. Jesus answered the guard with a question. If I said something wrong, testify about what is wrong. But if I spoke rightly, why did you strike me? It was, again, a legally framed response, and it went nowhere. He was sent on to Caiaphas. The house of Caiaphas was almost certainly a large priestly residence in the upper city of Jerusalem, the wealthy southwestern quarter of the city, where the elite families of the priesthood maintained their large stone homes with their internal courtyards and their ritual baths and their imported pottery and their distance from the crowded lower neighborhoods where most of Jerusalem actually lived. Archaeological work in the Jewish quarter of modern Jerusalem has uncovered several such residences from exactly this period. Houses with multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, stone vessels everywhere because stone did not contract ritual impurity the way ceramic did. Evidence of wealth and status visible in the quality of the construction, the mosaic floors, the frescoed walls. It was in the courtyard of one of these houses that Peter, who had followed at a distance after his initial flight, was warming himself by a charcoal fire. The Greek word used, anthrakia, a charcoal fire, is specific. It appears only twice in the entire New Testament, here and later in the scene by the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, when Jesus himself has built a charcoal fire on the beach and is cooking fish for his disciples. The verbal echo is not accidental. John, at least, wants you to feel the weight of that repetition. The same kind of fire, a very different kind of conversation. At Caiaphas's courtyard fire, Peter denied 3 times that he knew Jesus. The details of those denials in the gospel accounts are layered with texture. A servant girl who worked the door, other bystanders, someone who specifically identified Peter as a Galilean, not because they recognized his face, but because they recognized his accent. Galileans spoke Aramaic with a distinctive northern pronunciation, dropping certain consonants, shading certain vowels in ways that marked them immediately to Jerusalem ears as outsiders, as provincials, as people from the margins of Jewish religious and cultural life. Peter could not hide where he came from. His voice gave him away. And when the rooster crowed, Luke records something that the other gospel writers do not. Jesus, somewhere in that courtyard or visible through a doorway, turned and looked at Peter. Not a word is recorded, just the look. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. The trial before the Sanhedrin, or whatever form of formal Jewish legal process, actually occurred that night, a question scholars debate with considerable energy, centered eventually on a single question. Caiaphas, standing up, asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered, in Mark's account, with the same 2 words he had used when the soldiers came for him in the garden, "I am." And then he added words from Daniel and from Psalm 110, images of a figure seated at God's right hand, coming on the clouds of heaven, that made the theological claim explicit and, in the ears of the high priest, constituted blasphemy serious enough to require a death sentence. The high priest tore his robes. This was not dramatic gesture for effect. The tearing of garments was a specific, codified response to blasphemy in Jewish law, a physical act that permanently marked the moment as one of ultimate religious rupture. You could not repair those robes. The tear was meant to be irreversible. The verdict was unanimous among those present. He deserved death, but they could not carry it out themselves. This is the detail that changes the entire political architecture of what followed. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish authorities in Judea had lost the right of capital punishment. The precise legal boundaries of this restriction are debated by historians, but the practical reality is clear enough from the gospel accounts themselves. The chief priests and elders, having reached their verdict before dawn, needed Rome to execute it. They needed Pilate. And getting what they wanted from Pilate required a specific kind of argument. Not a theological one, but a political one. Rome did not care about blasphemy. Rome cared about order, about taxation, about the prevention of revolt. If they were going to hand this man to the prefect and ask for a crucifixion, they needed to frame the charge in language that a Roman administrator would find compelling. This is why the accusation shifts when Jesus is brought before Pilate. Before the Sanhedrin, the charge was theological. Blasphemy, the claim to be the Son of God. Before Pilate, the charge becomes political. Claiming to be King of the Jews, forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar, stirring up the people from Galilee to Jerusalem. These were the categories Rome understood. These were the categories that could get a man killed by the state, rather than by religious tribunal. The movement from Caiaphas's house to the Praetorium, Pilate's Jerusalem residence, almost certainly the large Herodian palace on the western edge of the upper city, rather than the Antonia fortress, as older tradition sometimes placed it, covered only a short distance in physical terms. But in social and political terms, it crossed a vast boundary. The accusers could not even enter the Praetorium themselves. John records that they stayed outside to avoid ritual contamination. Entering a Gentile residence during Passover week would have rendered them impure and unable to participate in the festival. So Pilate had to come out to them, the most powerful Roman official in the region, walking out to conduct a capital trial on a stone pavement in the early morning, because the men demanding an execution were too religiously scrupulous to step inside his door. This awkward geography is not incidental. It speaks to the absurdity and the brutality of what was happening simultaneously. Men who were meticulously careful about ritual purity were, at the same moment, orchestrating the death of a man they had tried in the middle of the night without the procedural protections that Jewish law technically required. The concern for the letter of the law and the complete abandonment of its spirit occupied the same moment, the same courtyard, the same pale morning light. Pilate questioned Jesus. The exchanges recorded in the Gospels, particularly in John, are among the most carefully constructed dialogues in ancient literature. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus responds with a question of his own. "Is that your own idea? Or did others tell you about me?" Pilate pushes back. "Am I a Jew? Your own people handed you over. What have you done?" And then Jesus makes a statement that must have been genuinely puzzling to a Roman prefect trained in the hard realities of imperial administration. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." Pilate, grasping for a category that makes sense. "So you are a king?" "Jesus, you say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." Pilate, with a weariness that feels entirely real across 2,000 years. What is truth? He did not wait for an answer. He went back out to the crowd. The account of Pilate's attempts to release Jesus, offering Barabbas as an alternative, sending him to Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem for the festival, declaring 3 times that he found no basis for a charge, has sometimes been read as evidence of a sympathetic or even noble Roman official caught in an impossible situation. The historical record of Pontius Pilate outside the Gospels complicates that reading considerably. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, writing within living memory of these events, describes Pilate in terms that are startling in their harshness. A man known for briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injuries, constant executions without trial, savage ferocity. This is not a portrait of a reluctant idealist. This is a portrait of a brutal administrator who had already been officially reprimanded by Rome for his handling of Judean affairs. What the Gospel accounts may be capturing, then, is not a man with a conscience wrestling with justice. It may be a man with a political problem wrestling with optics, crucifying a popular teacher during Passover week in front of a city already packed with pilgrims, already inflamed by messianic expectation, was exactly the kind of thing that could spiral into the kind of public disorder that got prefects recalled to Rome in disgrace. Pilate had reason to be careful. He had reason to hesitate. But he did not have the will, or perhaps the political capital, to absorb the pressure being applied by the temple establishment and the crowd they had assembled in that courtyard. When the crowd shouted, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar," invoking the Roman political concept of amicitia Caesaris, the formal relationship of loyalty and benefit that defined a provincial official's standing with the emperor, Pilate understood exactly what was being said. It was not a theological argument. It was a threat. Accusations of disloyalty to Caesar in the political climate of Tiberius's reign were not abstract. They were career-ending, potentially life-ending. The chief priests had found the precise lever that would move a Roman prefect, and they pressed it without hesitation. Pilate sat down on the judgment seat. John identifies the place as the lithostrotos, the stone pavement, and pronounced the sentence. It was, by Roman reckoning, approximately the 6th hour. The morning had been long. Before crucifixion, Roman practice prescribed flogging. The instrument used, the flagrum or flagellum, was not a simple whip. It was a handle with multiple leather thongs, each thong weighted at the end with pieces of bone or metal, designed to tear into skin and muscle with each stroke, wrapping around the body, the weights digging in before the thong was pulled back. Roman flogging was not a fixed number of strokes the way Jewish law prescribed a maximum of 40. Roman flogging continued at the soldier's discretion or the officer's order until the desired effect was achieved. Men died from it. Men were left incapable of walking from it. The physical condition of Jesus before the crucifixion even began was, by any honest medical assessment, catastrophic. The soldiers added their own elaborations, a crown woven from thorns. The specific plant is debated, but candidates in the Jerusalem region include varieties with thorns long enough and rigid enough to penetrate to the skull. A purple robe, probably a soldier's cloak, the closest available approximation to royal purple, thrown over shoulders already stripped raw. The salutation, "Hail, King of the Jews," the blows, the spitting. These were not random cruelties. They were a performance, a deliberate theatrical mockery of the claim that had been presented to Pilate, a ritual humiliation designed to make the charge of kingship visibly, physically, grotesquely absurd. In a culture where honor was not merely an internal feeling but a public social reality, enacted and witnessed and validated by the community around you, this performance carried a specific meaning. It was designed to annihilate not just the body, but the social identity of the person at its center. By the time they placed the crossbeam on his shoulders and led him out through the city gates, the public message had already been delivered repeatedly and unmistakably. This man was nothing. This man had been reduced to the lowest possible category of human existence. What was about to happen outside the walls was the formal and final confirmation of what had already been enacted inside them. He fell under the weight of the crossbeam. A man named Simon of Cyrene, a North African Jewish pilgrim in Jerusalem for Passover, pulled out of the crowd at random, was forced to carry it the rest of the way. The place was called Golgotha. The Aramaic word means skull, Golgotha, and the Latin translation, Calvaria, gives us the English word Calvary. The precise location has been debated for centuries, but the most credible archaeological and historical evidence points to a site just outside the northwestern wall of Jerusalem, in an area that had served as a quarry in earlier centuries and still contained old tomb chambers cut into the rock face. It was visible from the road. This was not accidental. Crucifixion was a public medium. It was Rome's most elaborate and deliberate communication technology, a message written in human suffering and posted at the city gates for every pilgrim, every merchant, every traveler passing in and out of Jerusalem to read and internalize. The message was always the same: this is what happens to those who challenge the order we maintain. The cross itself requires some reconstruction, because 2,000 years of Christian iconography have given most people a mental image that may not correspond precisely to what was actually used in first-century Judea. Roman crucifixion was not standardized in the way that later artistic tradition implies. The upright post, the steeps, was often a permanent fixture at an execution site, reused repeatedly. The condemned man carried only the crossbeam, the patibulum, which was then lifted and fixed to the upright. The height of the finished cross was probably lower than most paintings suggest, low enough that the feet of the crucified man were only a short distance from the ground. close enough that the soldiers assigned to guard the execution could converse with him without raising their voices, close enough that the people who passed by could read the inscription nailed above his head without straining. That inscription, the titulus, the written charge, the legal justification for the execution, was attached above the condemned man's head as a standard element of Roman crucifixion procedure. Pilate had it written in 3 languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The 3 languages of public life in first-century Jerusalem, the vernacular of the Jewish population, the administrative language of the empire, the commercial and cultural lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Whatever Pilate's motivations in writing it the way he did, and the chief priests protested immediately, asking him to change the King of the Jews to "This man claimed to be King of the Jews," a distinction Pilate refused. The trilingual inscription meant that virtually every literate person in the enormous Passover crowd passing that road could read it in their own language. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The soldiers divided his garments among themselves, casting lots for his seamless tunic rather than tearing it. This detail, so apparently minor, is recorded in all 4 Gospels. John explicitly connects it to Psalm 22. "They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." A psalm that begins with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that, taken in its entirety, moves from the most extreme expression of abandonment and suffering in the Hebrew Scriptures toward an unexpected conclusion of vindication and praise. The people standing at the foot of the cross, who knew that psalm, and in a crowd of Jewish Passover pilgrims, many would have known it, were receiving layer upon layer of scriptural resonance in real time, whether they recognized it or not. The physical process of crucifixion killed through a combination of mechanisms: exhaustion, exposure, hypovolemic shock from blood loss, and eventually, almost certainly, asphyxiation, as the muscles supporting the chest wall gave out and breathing became impossible without pushing up against the nails through the feet to lift the body and expand the lungs. It was slow. It was designed to be slow. The Romans had refined it over centuries into a method that maximized duration of suffering and therefore maximized the public deterrent effect. A man could survive on a cross for days. The soldiers at Golgotha were not there to watch a brief ceremony. They were there for a working shift, guarding a site of state execution, eating and drinking and gambling with dice, while 3 men died above them by degrees. 3 men. This detail also passes too quickly in most retellings. Jesus was crucified between 2 others, described in the Gospels as lestai, a Greek word that means bandits or insurrectionists, the same word used elsewhere in the Gospels to describe the activity Jesus accused the temple merchants of turning God's house into. These were not petty thieves. Roman crucifixion was not deployed against ordinary criminals. These were men convicted of violent resistance against the imperial order, the exact category of political threat that the charge of kingship was designed to invoke. In dying between them, Jesus was visually, publicly, officially classified alongside them. The placement was part of the sentence. From the cross, Jesus spoke. 7 statements are recorded across the 4 Gospel accounts, and each one repays the kind of close historical attention we have been bringing to everything else in these final hours. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Addressed, apparently, to the soldiers carrying out the execution. Men doing a job, following orders, without theological investment in the specific identity of the man they were nailing to wood. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Spoken to one of the men dying beside him, who had, in Luke's account, rebuked his fellow criminal and asked Jesus to remember him. Woman, here is your son. to his mother, standing close enough to hear him, with the disciple John beside her, a practical arrangement made for her care in the immediate aftermath. These were not abstract pronouncements. They were specific, relational, directed at specific people in a specific crisis. The darkness. All three synoptic Gospels record that from the 6th hour, approximately noon, to the 9th hour, approximately 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. 3 hours. Attempts to explain this as a solar eclipse have always foundered on the astronomical fact that solar eclipses cannot occur during a full moon, and Passover always falls on a full moon. What exactly happened and how widely it extended, the text does not explain. What it records is the experience of it. A midday darkness falling over a hillside already dense with suffering and watching, a sensory dislocation that the crowd would have read through the lens of the Hebrew prophetic tradition, where darkness at noon was a specific sign of divine judgment. The prophet Amos had written it centuries earlier, "I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." In a crowd steeped in that tradition, 3 hours of unexpected darkness was not a meteorological curiosity. It was a text. And then, near the end of the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice the opening words of Psalm 22, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" The bystanders misheard, or pretended to mishear, thinking he was calling for Elijah. Someone offered him wine vinegar on a sponge, the pasca that Roman soldiers carried as a standard ration drink, sour wine mixed with water, the everyday beverage of the working poor and the military. Not a cruelty, not a kindness, just the ordinary liquid of ordinary people, offered in a moment of absolute extremity. He received it. And then, John records, he said, "It is finished." The Greek word is tetelestai, a single word, perfect tense, active voice. It was a word used in commercial contexts to mark a debt as paid in full, a transaction as completed, an obligation as discharged. Whatever its theological freight, and the tradition has spent 2 millennia exploring that, on the lips of a man who had spent his last breath on it, in the specific linguistic world of 1st century Greek commerce and law, it carried the unmistakable weight of completion. Not defeat, not resignation. Completion. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The temple curtain tore, the earth shook. A Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross, a professional soldier, a man who had watched executions for a living, a Gentile with no theological stake in what had just happened, looked at what he had seen and said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The tomb was borrowed. The burial was hurried, because sundown was approaching and the Sabbath with it, and Jewish law required that the dead be buried before the Sabbath began. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to the verdict, went to Pilate personally and asked for the body. The request itself was an act of considerable courage. Approaching the prefect after a politically charged execution, associating himself publicly with the man who had just been crucified as an insurrectionist king. He was given the body. He wrapped it in linen cloth. He placed it in a new tomb cut from rock, a tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Again, a detail of honor in a day that had contained almost none. A great stone was rolled against the entrance. The disciples were scattered, terrified, hidden behind locked doors in the city. The women who had stood at the cross, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, others, noted where the tomb was, intending to return after the Sabbath with spices to complete the burial properly. The city was quiet. The Passover lambs had been eaten. The pilgrims would begin their journeys home. The festival was ending. And in a borrowed tomb on the edge of an old quarry outside the city walls, the body of a Galilean carpenter's son lay in the particular silence that only the recently dead inhabit. Still and cold and wrapped in cloth, in the last darkness before the first day of the week began. What happened next is not the subject of this account, but the context for understanding it is. If these hours, the garden, the arrest, the trials, the flogging, the procession through the city, the cross, the darkness, the torn curtain, the borrowed tomb, if all of this happened not in a timeless spiritual space, but in a specific city, in a specific week, inside a specific web of political and social and religious tensions that were as real and as grinding as anything in human experience, then the claim that followed 3 days later did not emerge from mythology. It emerged from history, from a body, from a borrowed tomb, from the most documented and most devastating day in the life of a community that then went on to change the world. That is not a small thing to sit with. The faith that came out of that Friday was not built on comfortable certainties. It was built by people who had watched everything collapse and then encountered something they could not explain away. Understanding the world they lived in, the smell of the Kidron, the weight of the crossbeam, the sound of Aramaic in a Galilean accent, the specific social humiliation of a public trial in the dark, does not diminish what they believed. It makes it more serious, more grounded, more worthy of the attention we bring to it. Jesus was not a figure from a stained glass window. He was a man who walked on stones that still exist, who bled in a city that is still inhabited, who died under a sentence pronounced by a prefect, whose name is still legible on an inscription discovered in Caesarea Maritima in 1961. He entered the most brutal machinery his world possessed and did not step aside from it. That is the truth the final hours contain, and it has not grown smaller with the telling.